I actually struggled to get out of the deck chair outside just a minute ago, so I'm glad I'm back in the room. Now, so this afternoon we're going to be looking at core strand 4, and so we are still kind of working our way through the pebble pad materials, and we're going to have this session which is focused on change, and then we're going to have a kind of a short plenary session at the end. But what we've just agreed, which I hope is going to be okay with everyone, is that because you're a small group, that perhaps we will have this session as a slightly shorter session, because it shouldn't take as long to feedback from the breakout groups. And we're not going to have a break in between the session itself and the plenary. So it should mean that we finish a little bit earlier, probably about 3 o'clock or something like that. And so I hope that's okay with everybody. Right, I think we're ready to get going, and the recording has started. Okay, so just to introduce myself, my name's Carmel Conn. I'm based at the University of South Wales, and I'm doing the session this afternoon with Fliss, whom we're going to share the session with you. And as I said, this afternoon session is focused on the issue of change, and we're definitely going to be picking up many of the threads actually that we looked at this morning, some of the threads that came up this morning, but we're going to look at them specifically on this issue of what do we do about some of these things that we know about inclusive education, like, for example, effective practices. How do we create change so that there is more in the way of effective practice that we know is effective in relation to inclusive education? So I'm going to get up my slides because I've got a presentation here. So I'm just going to share my slides. Hopefully I will be able to. So hopefully you can see those. Is that okay, Fliss? Yep, okay. So I'll just put those on present mode. Right, and as I say, this afternoon session, we're focusing on core strand 4 of the pebble pad materials. Now, in those materials, what you're asked to look at, it doesn't really matter if you haven't looked at them yet, but what you're asked to look at is the whole issue of change and what we understand about change. And in particular, you're asked to think about 2 models for change. Lewin's model, 3-step model, and Kotter's 8-step model, and but essentially it's the same kind of principle, that actually change is about kind of focusing in on what is important to change, and then to think about how to do that, how to kind of bring about change in that particular area.
Is that Carmel frozen or mine?
I think Carmel is frozen.
Let me just send her a direct message. Fliss, can you jump? Oh, you can't move the slides on or anything, can you? Because it's at Carmel's end. Okay.
Sorry, I can't move the slides on, but I can set you up a little bit for the way we're going to be looking at the this in the breakout rooms for the next activity. I know everyone's been really busy at school and may not have had an opportunity to look at what's on Pebble Pad yet. But one of the things, and it's been posted in the chat as well to make it more accessible, is looking at the professional standards of teaching and learning. And so we're just going to be having a little think about those in terms of how you can make change through those 5 areas. So we'll, when we go into the breakout rooms, we're going to be thinking about what kind of pedagogy can we use to help with change, what kind of collaboration, leadership, what kind of innovative elements can we use, and also to think about professional learning and how we can use those things to move things forward. So, you know, you'll all be familiar with those 5 areas. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to be thinking about when we come to the breakout rooms. So Carmel, when she manages to get back in to back into the conference this afternoon, will be taking you through those kind of skills that we need to be able to engage and challenge the key stakeholders. You know, as and it was Kelly was saying to Jonathan, what do we do, you know, when we come up against problems? You know, we've got ideas, things that we, you know, maybe through training, maybe through personal experience. What can we actually do if we're coming up against challenges? It's a really good point. So this is the point when we're moving from the kind of theory to the practice, and I'm sure you've all experienced times when you've come up against difficulties. I know I certainly had as a practitioner. Carmel, hello.
Hi, that was actually very dramatic.
It was
thrown out. It said there was an advanced threat warning.
Oh my goodness.
That's never happened to me on Teams before, but anyway, I literally got thrown out of that meeting.
Oh gosh. Okay. All I've done, I haven't, because I couldn't move on the slides, I've just explained to everybody a little bit about what we'll be doing in things to consider when we go into the first breakout room around the professional standards. So
okay, thanks very much, Liz. So sorry about that, everybody. That was extremely it was dramatic on my part. I had this big notice that just came up, but anyway, I don't think there is an advanced threat warning. I'm just at home in my sitting room, so I think everything's all right. Right, so let me think about where I was. So core strand 4, Pebble Pad, we're thinking about change in relation to inclusive education. So yeah, so we're thinking about what we know about what brings about change, but in relation to additional learning needs and this idea of inclusive education. And the kind of things to bear in mind is that as came up this morning, in fact, is that change in relation to inclusion is not about doing something to learners necessarily. It's about thinking at all levels of the system. So thinking about what goes on around learners, including kind of quite distant things such as leadership and sort of environmental issues and a whole range of issues. So it's definitely thinking in terms of a change at the relation of a kind of systems level change, and how we think about that. And of course, what also came up this morning was that there are tensions in this area. So there are tensions in relation to what people believe about what it is that we're focused on in relation to additional learning needs and inclusive education. I think some people mentioned that actually in the feedback from the discussion, this tension between different agenda. Somebody said this morning that they found there was this tension between education and psychology. And Jonathan Glasgow, he was talking about tensions between a social model of disability and a medical model of disability. So those tensions are very much about kind of where the focus of change is. Is it focused on the learner? Are they what needs to change? Or is it focused on something bigger? Is it what's on around the learner? Is that what needs to change? And why this is kind of particularly important for us working in Wales, for practitioners who are working in Welsh schools, is that this tension in relation to belief about what it is that needs to change, seems to be a particularly pertinent one for Wales at this moment in time, and it's certainly a pertinent one for other places as well. But it's definitely, research shows that actually there is this kind of different belief systems that are operating in Welsh schools and colleges, where some people are focused on change within learners and see that as a kind of important area, that you've got to do something kind of different with learners, and the kind of the burden of change is on the learner and how they are. And then other people see it as a kind of wider systemic issue, that actually it's about change in teachers' beliefs, in teaching practices, in schools and school cultures, in leadership. And so I've posted a couple of things in the chat, and one of them is, the first one I posted is a policy brief which reports on research which I was involved with, and Rhiannon, actually, who runs this ALN pathway, and also researcher at Bristol University. And it shows exactly this kind of tension that's around in the Welsh education sector, where people have these kind of differing beliefs about what it is that needs to be the focus of change. And also in your reading on PebblePad, that research article by Catherine Knight and others, I was involved in that as well. That very clearly shows this kind of divergence of views that exist in relation to change and what needs to change. Okay, so my thing is not moving on. Oh dear, it's going to be one of those afternoons. Right, there we go. So the aims of the session today is to, first of all, we're going to be thinking about what kind of key processes are involved in change in relation to inclusive education. And we're going to particularly focus on the role of the Elenco, which is something else that came up today, and kind of why that is centrally important in relation to this issue of change. Then we're going to think about effective practice. So we looked already at a slide this morning, Anne showed a slide this morning around effective practices, and but we're going to think about that in relation to how do we support change in relation to these effective practices. So kind of actually research into inclusive education shows what's effective in terms of practice. It's not really that we need to kind of find out more about what's effective practice. It's more about how do we need to shift towards those effective practices. That's the kind of issue. And finally, as our kind of second activity of this session, we're going to look at the professional standards, which again were mentioned this morning, but we're going to look at them in a little bit more detail and think about them in relation to this idea of supporting change towards a shift towards inclusive education. Right, okay, so substrand 1, so thinking about different theories of change. Now, what research into inclusive education very clearly shows is that actually what we're talking about in relation to kind of shifting practice in schools and colleges so that it is more inclusive is we're talking about social processes. It's pretty much in its entirety, we're thinking about how people think about something, what they believe, what they do, how they collaborate with each other, the sort of dialogue that goes on. So there's a kind of whole range of social processes that underpin this shift towards inclusive education. And it's these social processes that we're going to think about in the next little bit. Now, central to that is the work of the Elenco, and they kind of encapsulate this idea of inclusive education as a social process, because the role of the Elenco is not one where you say, okay, I'm going to make this class or I'm going to make this lesson more inclusive. You can't work like that. You have to work through other people. You have to work through you have to work through systems. You have to work through the organisation. You don't directly really do very much yourself. I mean, obviously, some Elencos in primary schools, they might be carrying out kind of small group work or something like that. But increasingly, and actually since the ALN reform, I think probably there's been quite a big shift towards the Elenco being much more a kind of mediator type role, and that they're working in a kind of strategic way as opposed to a sort of hands-on direct way. But what you find, and if some of you have looked at the PebblePad materials already, what you will find is that actually the Elenco role is quite a contradictory role. There's different roles that you have to carry out if you're an Elenco, and some of them are not actually that compatible. So, for example, you might be a collaborator where you are kind of working with others and having discussions and kind of planning and reviewing things, and you might be supporting others to do that. But then you might also be a kind of auditor, and thinking about the reading from Kearns, that's part of the PebblePad material, you know, that you might be the person who's expected to audit what's going on in your setting, and you know, to make judgments about performance and accountability and kind of degrees of practice and all that kind of stuff. So those two roles are kind of not that compatible. You might also be somebody who is supporting staff and supporting, let's say, a teacher who's feeling kind of a little bit anxious maybe about some of the pupils that they might be about to have into their classroom, but you might also be supporting those pupils who might also feel anxious for kind of other reasons. So it's quite there's a lot of tensions involved in the Elenco role. But essentially what Elencos do is they work through these kind of range of social processes. So there's lots, if you have an Elenco, you're going to have lots of meetings, you're going to have lots and lots of dialogue with a whole range of people, teachers, other support staff, other people working within the school, external agencies, health and social care agencies are coming in, parents, learners. You're going to be a leadership team, so you're going to have a kind of whole series of dialogue with a whole different groups of people, and it's through that dialogue and through those sort of collaborative practices that you will be seeking to kind of develop and change things within your setting. Now, what research shows about kind of what makes for a successful Elenco, and for this, that article by Struve, which is also in your PebblePad materials, that's actually a really good article. That article is really interesting. And what they found was that actually Elencos who were most effective were ones who were kind of most well-placed socially within their school. So they carried out a network analysis to find out kind of like how many social interactions and social contacts an Elenco had, and Elencos who had a very dense network, so those Senkos and Elencos who had lots and lots of relationships with people, they knew lots of people, they were probably well-established, long-standing learning support coordinators in their setting, they were much more successful than they were looking at Senkos who had much lighter networks, so didn't have nearly as many social connections and weren't as kind of centrally placed socially within their school. They also found that Senkos who had the endorsement of their leaders, so that not necessarily that the leader was doing the work, but that they publicly endorsed their Senko and said, look, this is the person who's kind of got this kind of expertise in this area, and this is this person's area, but in a kind of public way, that those Senkos were more successful. And they also found, very interestingly, that it was often the more successful Senkos were those who didn't necessarily directly carry out support work or even assessment. It was much more that there was a sense that they were a background kind of presence in the school. They had knowledge, they had experience, and people could go to them, but that people felt empowered to do those things themselves and then use the person in that role of Senko or Elenco as a kind of someone to go to and to seek advice. So it was this kind of quite subtle but certainly strong social connections that underpin a successful work of the Senko or Elenco. And that's because inclusive education is a social process, basically, within an educational setting. So now thinking in terms of this idea of change, there's also been research looking at kind of what supports change in this area, and work done by Alan Rouse nearly 20 years ago. So it's quite old, but it's still very definitely relevant, and you still see it being referred to. And what he found in his research is that actually there's these different areas of practice within education. So there's what you believe about what you're doing, so what you believe about a learner, how a learner learns, and how a teacher teaches them. Also what you know, so what you know in terms of perhaps the subject content of what you're teaching, but also how you teach it, about kind of how to manage lessons and groups and things like that. And then what you actually do in practice, how you enact those things. That all of those things are involved within inclusive education. But what he found very interestingly is that if you change one of those areas, then inevitably the other two will change as well. So to take as an example in relation to inclusive education, let's say you have a belief. So people's beliefs tend to be quite a kind of core part of who they are as a person. So let's say you have a belief that it's really important for all pupils in your class, all students, to be able to fit in. Okay, so some people have that as a belief within their belief system. They believe that the children and young people that they work with, it's really important for them to be able to fit in with groups of other kind of human beings, and that actually being able to do that in school or in college sets you up well then for later life, where you then will need to fit in the workplace, or fit in within families, or fit in with society. So that's a kind of a very, you find that is quite a common belief, that people who might present a little bit differently in relation to their learning, what they need to do is one of the things they need to do is they need to learn to be able to fit in with others. And then you find that actually what happens then is that kind of gives rise to certain practices. So you get practitioners who will say, okay, so this person needs to learn to fit in. So they may not want to sit as part of this group, or they may not want to join the line with everybody else, or they might not want to do this. But it's really important for me to persuade them to do that, to encourage them to do it, to reward them if they do fit in and they do things in the same way as everybody else. So that's kind of like, that gives rise to certain practices, you see, in relation to what you do. Now, if you change that belief, now that belief might change because you might actually find out that for, let's say, most neurodivergent learners, that actually learning to fit in means that you actually mask the ways in which you're different. So you don't stim, or you don't sort of sit outside or somewhere that feels more comfortable to you. You do mask that and you do fit in. Actually, that then takes a toll on your well-being, your mental health, and it can actually have quite a devastating impact in relation to you as a person, this kind of stress of fitting in and masking who you really are. If you come to understand that as a practitioner, so that changes your knowledge, then that's actually going to change your belief system quite dramatically, isn't it? You're no longer going to believe that it's actually really important for somebody to learn to fit in. It's going to sort of dramatically overturn that belief. And as a result of that, it's also going to overturn your practice. So you're no longer going to encourage people to fit in and do something the same as everybody else. You're probably going to find ways of accommodating the ways in which people can be different. And I think what I want to point out is that you may have that belief, or both of those beliefs. You might believe them very strongly, and you might believe them for very good reasons. Like, when you talk to people about their belief systems, they often feel very strongly about their beliefs and why they believe this. So it's not, I think that's why this area, you kind of have to have respect for people's beliefs, and you can't just expect people to kind of throw up their beliefs and say, okay, I'm going to believe something else, because that's not the way beliefs work. But I'm going to come back to beliefs in a minute. Okay, so now I'm just going to show you this because it's not in the PebblePad materials, and it is in an article that I've also posted in the chat, and by Lanny Florian, so if you want to see it. So the work of Lanny Florian, which was also mentioned this morning, she and others have done a lot of research, very, very important research, actually, into what is inclusive education, what do inclusive practitioners particularly do. And it was just as Anne was saying this morning, what they found is that actually people don't really do things that are dramatically different, but they tend to kind of expand what they do to include more people. So they sort of make small and subtle adjustments that just then kind of accommodates more diversity within their classroom. So Lanny Florian, from this research that she has done into inclusive education, her and others, she developed what she has called the Inclusive Pedagogical Approach in Action, which is a bit of a mouthful, EiPAA. And in that, she developed these 3 areas that are important in relation to change. So that's what you can see on in that left-hand column. Now, what you might see in this is that the areas are, so one is that people that believe in diversity. So they have a belief that actually all learners are capable of learning, but that people learn in different ways, and that there's no kind of one fixed way of doing things. And there's also certainly not a fixed level of ability that you're going to reach as a sort of ceiling, and then you can't get beyond that. So people have this kind of expansive belief about learners. The second thing is that people have a belief in themselves as teachers, so that they believe that they are actually capable of teaching a whole range of learners, and they have a sort of level of confidence about that. And the third area is that people continually develop ways, they kind of do this problem solving, is what she calls it, around practice and teaching, so that when a learner presents something, you think creatively about, well, how do I teach this person? They don't seem to be able to be taught in the way that I would usually teach somebody, so I have to think creatively about this. And very importantly, what Lanny and Florian says is that actually people do that collaboratively, so you don't just think by yourself, you think with other people within your setting. You might think with the learners themselves, you might think with learners' parents, but you kind of do this collaborative, creative thinking where you kind of problem solve around teaching and learning, and you just see that as a natural part of pedagogy. That's what pedagogy is. So this framework here, that has been very influential, but and actually it underpins in Scotland now, which is where Lanny is based. There is a national framework for inclusion, and I've also posted that in the chat as well, because I thought maybe some of you might be interested in looking at that. They've got this new iteration of it as well, which is quite interesting. And Wales is following Scotland in a lot of ways, and certainly in this area. Actually, it's not following Scotland quite as closely in inclusion as it is with curriculum, but it is following Scotland a little bit. But as you probably can see, that all of these three areas that are set out in this framework are all social. There's nothing kind of that's technical. So it's not that you've got to apply a certain kind of way of teaching language, or you've got to apply some kind of intervention. It's not about that at all. It's all about how you work with people, how you think about people, and also how you think about yourself. So it's kind of like this. It's a very kind of good snapshot of this idea of inclusive education as this social process, and therefore a social process of change. Okay, so I've taken on my watch so that it's not clicking. I've lost the time now. Okay, so we're all right for time. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to move into our first activity. So we've got two activities this afternoon, and this is the first one. And we're going to give you, I think, about 15 minutes. Does that sound all right, Fliss? 15 minutes, and then probably about 5 minutes for feedback, something like that?
Yes, lovely.
Okay, so we're going to give you 15 minutes, so it's quite a generous time, but this is for you to think about your setting, okay, in relation to what I've just described to you. So this idea of people's beliefs. So beliefs are absolutely central to this area, and thinking about what beliefs operate in your setting and compare it to other people within your group, particularly around these descriptors within the EiP. So people's beliefs about learners, people's beliefs about themselves, and people's belief about kind of what needs to be done in relation to practice. So what we're going to ask you to do is to just describe that to each other, and to kind of think about the ways in which you might be similar in terms of settings, or might be different in terms of settings. And then we're going to ask you to come back in 15 minutes time, so at 2:15, and to feed back from your two groups. And Fliss is going to facilitate that. And what we would ask you is that if you would switch on your camera. So when you are in your breakout rooms, if you could switch on your camera and unmute yourself, that would be really good, particularly since you're quite a small group. And we'll give you a little bit of a countdown just before you're due to come back.
Perfect. Opening the rooms now.
Thank you.